Good evening, everybody. How is everyone tonight?
I don't know if that's
everybody a good seat or a bad
That's
seat.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Wow, I have to say we are pretty stoked to be here, and what a great turnout. This is more than we expected, so this is going to be exciting, I hope.
Oh, it's exciting already because I haven't hung out with John for about
since November.
November, really heavy, and so it's always a great pleasure to be able to spend a little time. So thanks for inviting me down here, getting us back together,
inviting us down here. He always does that. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight. First and foremost, Zach and I are not scholars. We don't even play scholars on TV, but we are at the Clinton School, so we are going to be as scholarly as possible tonight. And what we want to do, or what we're going to attempt to do, is to connect some dots and kind of lead us all down a path that will at least get you all thinking about tiny houses and the impact that they can have on a grander scale for our country, for the planet, and at best win us some sort of Nobel Prize or something. I mean, that's at best case scenario. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but yeah, if anyone knows anybody, just put in a good word.
Yeah, but we are going to leave some room at the end, and we're going to take some questions and have some fun with it. So I'm going to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I have a tendency to get kind of deep. I mean, the tiny houses, it's hard to talk about tiny houses without kind of touching on some pretty heavy subjects, right? And so I tend to rant a little bit. And John is here, and he's going to help me stay on course so I don't bore you guys.
And
he's even got a buzzer. That's how serious this is.
Let me see if I can even pull the buzzer up. Of course, now I can't pull it up, so I might just have to buzz. But yeah, we're going to try and keep this focused. And like Zach said, if there's any questions about anything that we talked about, tiny houses in general, what it's like for Zach to be a professional skier, I mean, whatever it is you guys want to talk about, personal life, we're happy to answer, anything. So, hang on to those questions. But in the meantime, bear with us here as we lead you down this little fun little path. And I tell you, I'm taking it seriously. I even have these notes right here. So what we're going to attempt to do, our thesis, we want to talk about residential segregation and what that is and why residential diversity is much better, and how tiny houses can really affect that, be an effective tool to combat that. That's what we're going to attempt to do. So before we even go any further than that, residential segregation, when we talk about that, what does that even mean?
So residential segregation is something that's very easy to understand. It's basically rich people live on one side of our cities, poor people live on the other side of the tracks, right? It's something that has been It's been employed in the United States after Jim Crow in ways that have contributed to not just economic segregation, but also racial segregation, and has led to certain places in our country being very divided. And
don't make me buzz you right off the bat. This was just the introduction. You're already going down to deep explanation.
It's the opposite, right?
So residential diversity is the opposite of residential segregation. And why is residential diversity a good thing?
Well, residential diversity basically means that we have communities where you have more affluent people living in closer proximity to less affluent people. And what that really does, I mean, without getting buzzed, is that it decentralizes the low-income individuals within our society, right? Because there's a very damaging effect whenever we create more or less a slum by taking all the low-income individuals, citizens in our society, in our community, and pushing them to the outskirts of town, which is how affordable housing has really been implemented historically in our country. And it's led to further exacerbating the problem problem of the segregation based upon where people live.
So what we're talking about is trying to resurrect, one way to resurrect the American dream, this idea of upward mobility, of having opportunity, and that's what we talk about. When you have communities that are segregated along economic lines, it oftentimes becomes along racial lines as well, but if we're just talking about the economics of it, there's not as much opportunity for low income as there is for high income, and how do we combat that? That's what we want to talk about. That's pretty heady, I know. Before we get any further down that path, we should tell you a little bit more about us. First of all, just a show of hands. Have people seen Tiny House Nation, the show, in here? Okay, so good, a fair amount of people. Okay, for most of you that saw it, was that your introduction to tiny homes, or at least maybe more of an education on what a tiny home was? I'm seeing a lot of heads. Yes. Okay, so Zach and I have been at that show since the spring of 2014. We've done 84 episodes, which maybe doesn't sound like that much, but 84 builds is an awful lot of work. And through that time, we've put in our 10,000 hours. Zach had a few hours before that. I was new to the tiny house movement when the show started. It was not my background. I was formerly a sportscaster. I did that for like 10 years in San Diego. Great job. But when I was introduced to the concept, much like Megan, who introduced us, it resonated immediately. The idea, especially the environmental aspect of it, that really seemed to ring true to me. And then I've had the opportunity over the last 5 years to have this master class in what a tiny house is and what it can be by spending sometimes more time with this guy than with my own family on the road.
Yeah, and I came to tiny houses in a different way, right? To me, I was very passionate about trying to pursue being a professional skier. It's like, everybody's got a talent and we all want to pursue this dream. Well, to me, a tiny house really was a tool that I was able to use to avoid falling down that financial trap that leads people treading water in their lives. Right? It's so easy where your bills become to a certain point, maybe with student loan or however it happens, that you can't actually pursue your dreams because you're just busy getting by. And so for me, a tiny home was this moment. I had a friend actually die, and it was a big catalyst for me to say, that's it. I'm going to do something drastic. I'm not going to let life go by. I'm going to do something that's within my control. And within my control is downsizing on the payments that I have to make every month so that I can focus my life doing the thing that I wanted to do and I was passionate about. And it took many years of living in a very minimalist capacity.
Being a ski bum.
Yes, but it did free myself up to really spend all winter long. I would build houses in the summer, save up money, and then live in a van or live in an RV or on couches or whatever it took to be able to pursue that dream. And so when the tiny house came by and I first was aware of it, it wasn't this question of, couldn't I do that, or what's that's about. It was like, aha, that's perfect. And within 5 months I had built one, and it just took over my life ever since, because it was such an effective tool for me to be able to follow my passions, and it worked. And I ended up becoming a professional skier and spent 10 years getting paid to do what I love, and it was a fantastic experience that leaves me feeling very good about being an advocate and an ambassador for this movement, because it worked in my life.
Yeah, and more importantly, it led you to me, and we got to be friends.
Well, yeah, obviously.
If we're going to cut through all of the chasing life's goals and stuff and success. So I have a question, and I would just yell out any answer you think. What is a tiny home? What's a tiny home? Under 500 square feet. Anybody else? On wheels. Mobile. Any other? You must know what a tiny home is. What do you think a tiny home is? Environmentally friendly, I heard.
Affordable.
Cheap, affordable. Okay. Off-grid.
Quick to clean.
So listen, what I'm here to say, and I think it's really important, I do want to sort of define what a tiny house is, and you're all right. It's every one of those things. A tiny house isn't just one thing, okay? And we're going to talk about tiny houses in a little bit more broad sense. I mean, over the course of hanging out with Zack, I think what we've really become proponents of appropriate sized living as opposed to necessarily tiny house living, where I don't know that 5,000 square feet for two people is appropriate, just like I don't know if 400 square feet for six people is appropriate. You know, so we talk a lot about appropriate sized housing, and when we talk about a tiny house, what we really are talking about is an efficient house, efficient of space, an economy of space, making sure you have everything that you need, but nothing that you don't. Okay, that's what we really talk about when we talk about a tiny house. I think that's important as we go down this discussion, because there are a lot of different things that tiny houses are. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason that we're kind of opening this discussion is because people tend to get tunnel vision when they say tiny house. And it depends on whether the first time you were exposed to the term tiny house came from an article from Los Angeles about little shacks that people are building for homeless people, or if it's coming from a TV show that showed something that was more of a luxury kind of RV. And so it's important, because when we start talking about tiny houses, people tend to have this kind of one take vision on what we're talking about. What we're really just talking about is highly functional small spaces. So that could be a micro apartment, that could be a tiny home on wheels, that could be an accessory dwelling unit on a foundation. It's more or less the way the space is built, and the way that it's used is what defines whether it's a tiny house. And to give you a good example of that, it's just the word tiny is a word that doesn't mean anything without perspective.
I have a buzzer, just be careful.
Well, okay, so, you know, what is a tiny home? Is it 500 square feet? Well, what if 6 people are living in there? Is it 700 square feet? Well, what if 7 people are living in there, right? So it doesn't do us all that much good to focus on the square footage and more look at it as this home style that people are connected to, in the idea that it's attainable, right?
Okay, good. Stop. I just wanted to find a tiny house.
There it is.
Okay, so the idea, so we kind of have an idea of how we're thinking about what a tiny house is. We've talked a little bit about, you know, our stated goal here is that tiny houses can affect, in a positive way, residential segregation. So that's not a new concept, and this residential segregation and the benefits of residential diversity have long been known and studied. My question is, what's been standing in the way? And the first is building codes and zoning laws. Okay.
See how he just answered his own question there?
Yeah, I did. Well, that was a hypothetical question.
Yeah.
It was kind of felt like I should keep talking a little bit. And one of the things I will say, you know, Zack and I work on a television show. Okay, we fully understand that we work on a television show, and just by the definition of a television show, it's an entertainment product, right? That's what it is. If it's not entertaining, well, then we don't get to keep making them. You know, we didn't start the tiny house movement. We're not the only people in the tiny house movement, but what I do feel like we can claim, at least a little bit, one feather we can put in our cap, is that our show, being the first show out there, spawned other shows, spawned articles in magazines and newspapers, and we've helped to normalize a tiny house. In 2014, when the show was going to start, someone asked me, what's a tiny house? I said, I don't know, but I'll find out real quick. I think you would be hard-pressed to find anyone in this country who hasn't at least heard of a tiny house, right? And so I think that is something I feel really good about. And that understanding has now started to lead in a movement to some real change in building codes and in zoning laws. And Zack actually, and a couple of other tiny house advocates, were integral in rewriting the International Building Code.
Yeah, so there's actually an appendix in the International Building Code in the IRC that is basically an accommodation for spaces that are on foundations. This doesn't have to do with wheels. Homes that are on foundations that are 400 square feet or less are exempt from certain building code requirements that basically made it impossible, right? The building codes are set in place by a non-governmental nonprofit body, and what they do is they evaluate all the different current building trends and technologies, and they basically make a book that is adopted, and that book is adopted in 49 states and 22 countries. So it's a really powerful entity.
49 states?
Not Wisconsin.
Oh, man.
They're rogue operators.
Oh, boy. Cheeseheads.
So anyways, it was very interesting to be part of that process, to witness how it went down, and we were able to successfully articulate the need for this new appendix to the building code, and that actually was implemented in 2018. But the building codes are only...
Well, that's only part of it, right?
Really
The zoning is what is really... That's the dark little secret of the tiny house movement that rarely gets addressed, but is quite honestly the biggest hurdle, the hardest thing to understand. And it's something that we get asked about a lot. It's not what our show is about at all, right? And in some ways it can be a little misleading, because we sort of take you through this process and we drop the house off, and it's amazing, and it's all styled and looks great, and people go, oh, I want to do that, but then you find out, oh, there are these obstacles in place that won't allow that to happen. The good news is this is starting to change as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not changing all over the country in uniform manners, but the first big push within rearranging of zoning has been ADUs, and especially on the West Coast.
What's an ADU?
Sorry, accessory dwelling unit. It's basically like a grandmother apartment, a granny flat, or an apartment above the garage. It's a space that's got a bathroom, a kitchen, a fully functioning, livable space that's detached from the home. And basically, up and down the West Coast, they're passing like blanket legislation to allow accessory dwelling units into single-family resident zoning areas.
In other words, you have a lot that's zoned for just single family, but they're making an allowance where, okay, you can have another dwelling on this property.
If your lot is to a certain size,
sure.
There's some limitations depending on the place of how many lots per block can do it. Parking has been an issue. There's a lot of like real issues, but they're going through, after many years of very serious debate about this, they're actually implementing this up and down the West Coast.
And the idea on this, right, was that this would be a way to help people that own these properties help pay for it, and have lower income people have an opportunity to live in a more affluent area. However, there's been a problem with the ADUs. It hasn't played out like they thought it would.
Well, to summarize the problem with the ADUs, it's basically that the entire expense needs to be shouldered by the property owner. Right.
So you own a house, you got to build the granny flat.
Yes. So it basically is that there's a lot of people in the country that would love some relief from the financial stress that they have with their mortgage every month, but those are not the people that can then afford to take out another loan to build an ADU in their backyard to then put it on the rental market. And the result is it's been very disappointing for advocates of affordable housing like myself. The amount of ADUs that end up on the rental market is very, very low.
So that was one attempt.
It's going to get better over the years, but initially, sure, it's extremely low.
It's not the only thing going on. In Minnesota, just recently, in the last couple of months, at the end of 2018,
December,
they passed a really interesting zoning law.
Yeah, so this was...
Or repealed one.
Yeah, so basically what Minnesota did, or Minneapolis, it was like a 12-1 vote in the city council, and they completely did away with single-family zoning.
Think about that for a second.
Citywide. So what that means is that anywhere in Minneapolis right now, you can, if you're a homeowner, you can divide your home into duplex or triplex. And interesting part about this, and what brings this and makes this relevant to our talk, is that the very stated goal of the city council, and they were very clear about it, was that they were reversing laws that had been put in place systematically and intentionally to further segregation within their city. And it's, I'm not going to go bore you guys with all the reasons why that is, but that was profound in that was their reasoning for making the zoning change.
And
they also have an affordable housing crisis there too.
Certainly, but basically the idea that when you have something zoned for a single family dwelling, that's going to be a bigger lot and a bigger house. That's going to cost more money. So that is going to make it so that only the wealthier population can do that, and lower economic people cannot. And essentially, it puts the rich people in one place and the low economic people in another place.
Yeah, but many places in our country, and Minneapolis especially, those laws were put into place basically directly after Jim Crow laws expired, right? And so it was a replacement for laws that actually had been in place ensuring segregation. Now they were just using economics to make sure the same thing happened.
So what's changed now is that it's opened up Minneapolis for a more natural dispersion of economic wealth throughout the city, correct?
That's the goal. That's the goal. The problem with subdividing your home is that the people who really could use the rent, again, are put in this position of how are you going to afford to go through with a major renovation, shoulder all that expense, and then start collecting rent and have that trickle in over years and balance out that investment. However, for the people that can't afford it, it's a fantastic option for a lot of people to age in place. And at the same time, what it can do is it can create a naturally less expensive housing option because it's smaller. You're just not going to be able to rent it for the same. That type of process ends up taking longer than we all wish it would, if you're interested in affordable housing, which is really what we're talking about here.
So, but again, another step in the right direction.
All steps in directions to opening up options for human beings. And the thing about it is that right in the beginning, we started to try to deflect our ideas about what a tiny home is and try to open it up. Well, in my mind, when you take a home that's a certain size and you divide it into a triplex, you're basically creating tiny homes. They're apartments, but there's the relevance and the usefulness to society is no different.
Okay, so let's talk about, so that's a couple of examples, and again, we're connecting some dots. We're going to tie it up, I promise. So let's talk about what happened in Fresno, because what happened in Fresno, California, was very interesting, and it has to do with tiny homes on wheels. And just to give it a bit of a background on that, tiny homes on wheels, which I would say on our show has been 90 to 95% of the ones we do, and that's for a number of reasons. One, when you build it on wheels, it's treated like an RV, and so there are certain code that you don't have to worry about. It's easier to build. It's also the mobility factor of it. It's a little bit cheaper than a foundation built. So there's all these reasons we've built these. But like an RV, that was considered living in your car. And you can stay in your RV for 72 hours. But that's it. It's not a permanent thing, unless you're at an RV park or something like this. So
a lot of places, they let you stay for 30 days, but somehow on the 31st day, it's not livable.
So what happened in Fresno, they directly addressed this and had to deal with tiny houses on wheels, and it's significant for a couple of reasons.
Yeah, and what it really does is that it allows that expense of
first of all, what did they do? What did they say could happen in Fresno?
Oh, I was on it. I was about to really drop some knowledge right there.
I know, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, all right.
Just so we have some context.
Yes, okay. So what they did was they allowed accessory dwelling units to be movable. And the simple allowance of that word movable, what it does is it's small. It brings up some fears that maybe trailers are going to move into town. But the truth of the matter is what it does in practice for society is it allows the overhead expense and the upfront cost of creating a rental unit to be divided between the person that is looking to move into the rental unit and the homeowner. So it relieves that upfront cost requirement from being burdened and shouldered solely by the homeowner, making it much more accessible to millions of people in the country.
In other words, what you're saying is you own a house, you've got a big mortgage, you could use some help paying this rent. You don't have the money to build a granny flat. Well, the younger couple that doesn't have the money to buy that big house can build their tiny house on wheels. They shoulder that cost, and then they can park it in your backyard. That's what you're talking about. And now can rent that space from you. So now as the homeowner, this is a great option because there's no out-of-pocket other than there are some rules as far as like plumbing and electric and stuff that you'd have to dig out there, but that's minimal compared to the construction. That's what's important about the distinction of the tiny house on wheels.
Yeah, I think that a good ballpark figure, if you're going to run extended utilities from your home, because that's what this requires. It requires basically taking the utilities in your home and running them out to wherever the ADU is going to live. But you're talking about digging a trench. It's probably $15,000 at the most to extend utilities a decent ways into your backyard. And that's the type of expense that can really, a lot more people could foot that bill, especially because a lot of the work is just digging a trench. Anyways, that's kind of the way the finances work out. And in terms of the finances on the home side, there's a lot of people in this country that can afford a mortgage on a $120,000 home. You know, you're talking about a tiny home, they start about 50, right? So a 30-year mortgage on a $120 home comes to, what, about $600 a month, right? And that right there, if you can come up with a down payment and $600 a month, you get to own your own space. You don't own the land, but you have that dignity, that feeling of that's my house. And that dignity that comes with that sense of ownership, we can't discount the importance of that to society. And I think it's well understood. But the problem is that we don't really believe that we have tools to provide ownership to as many people as we would like.
So how this all relates, it's pretty easy, I guess, to make the connection. How this relates to residential diversity is this idea of a more natural dispersion of economic health, if you will, within a community. And what we're talking about is when you live in a community where your firefighters, your police, your teachers, servers at restaurants, when they can't live in the same community that they're serving, the whole community suffers. You know, I think it's easy to think about this, and you go to, Zack has said slums a couple times, and there's a real tendency to be like, well, it's all well and good, and we're all liberal-minded, but I don't know, not in my backyard, the NIMBY thing. But that, what we're really talking about is a robust community of everyone that's working in that community being able to live in that community and benefit and prosper from it. Okay, so that you can go to the schools. And it's not just a one-way thing. It's not just, this is good for low economic people. As Zach said, I think it's good for everybody, that intermingling. And so when we talk about residential diversity, it can have some really big effects. And by using tiny houses, sort of a dual... There's a dual aspect of benefit from this, because it's not just the residential diversity, it's the other benefits you get from a tiny house in general.
It very much is in line with the way that I think about design, whereas if it doesn't serve two functions, I probably should do something else. There's probably a better way for me to use my time. Well, allowing movable accessory dwelling units, let's not even call them tiny houses, can easily become a vehicle or a tool for our society to create affordable housing that's interspersed, to start chipping away at the residential segregation, which is a reality in our life, to start creating more energy efficient homes that people can actually live in, and to start creating a better opportunity for the children of the less affluent in our society. And there's been a couple of studies that have happened recently that have gotten a lot of awareness, and you might have heard about the Equality of Opportunity study. And I'm not going to really go into it, but it's basically it's evaluating residential segregation, and it's basically looking at different places in our country that have really high levels of economic mobility versus low levels of economic mobility. And the number one factor that they're coming to that actually contributes to this is the segregation residentially within that society. And the tendency for policymakers is to believe that that's a thing that we can't even start to address because that's so ingrained within, it's impractical. And I hear people throw around this word impractical all the time when it's coming to making actual changes within our zoning, right? That will never change. Well, any big movement, any big social movement, if you listen to the people that told you it was impractical, it would have never happened.
So we're going to light some fires. No, I'm just kidding. I wasn't sure where you were going with that.
Well, what I was going to say is that the key is that you have to identify the tools available to you if you want to make change. Tiny homes are only one of those tools. Maybe opening up a lot of single-family homes to more divisions in terms of duplexes and triplexes, that's another tool. There's different tools that are going to work in different places. A tiny home is never going to work for a big urban area where it's all apartment buildings. It's just not. But I think 52% of our country identifies as living in suburban areas, and then 27 are urban, and then after that it's rural. So only 27% of our country is living in those environments where tiny houses can't be any kind of use. That's still a lot of our country out there.
There's a lot of numbers you threw out there. But so that is essentially what we wanted to talk about. And I hope that we can start to get you to think about tiny houses as this tool that's not just a personal tool, like Zack was able to use it for himself, that basically let him follow a dream, but it can be a tool that society can use as well to hopefully address some well-known, long-standing issues, and do it in a way that is practical and not impractical.
Well, the impracticability has already been disproven by the amount of cities that are changing their their zoning codes, by the fact that we've actually changed the building code. I mean, it takes a long time. It's very frustrating, but it's happening. And until the housing crisis goes away, until the climate crisis goes away, tiny houses aren't going anywhere. So
that's
let's open it up for questions.
That's a lot that we've thrown at you. We do want to make sure that we open for questions. We talked to some high school kids earlier today, and I think we went a little too long before we got into the questions. We're happy to, like I said at the beginning, to really answer anything you have. Anything about what we've spoken about tonight, anything about the show and the business of making TV, anything about tiny houses in general, or even our personal lives, whatever questions you may have. I mean, we may not answer everything, but you're welcome to ask. So if there's any questions, and we're not leaving until we hear someone in the balcony ask a question. So just be ready.
There's a mic up there.
Okay, great. So I see someone in the back here. You got a microphone coming.
Seeing that we live in Arkansas, maybe it's not just an Arkansas thing, I don't think the problem is so much the perception of having a tiny house on your property as it is having a trailer on your property. What's the difference between a trailer and a tiny house?
Great. Zach's got thoughts on this, but I want to jump in. The number one thing that I learned from Zack is that what it looks like counts. What it looks like counts. And Jay Schaefer, who is Zack will call the godfather of the tiny house movement, what he did was he built a cute, cottagey, tiny home on a trailer and brought it down into San Francisco. And it didn't look like a mobile home. It didn't look like a trailer. What it looked like was a house out of a fairy tale. And everyone went, my God, how do I get one of those? So what it looks like matters. And we talk about that all the time. And it should match what the, architecture of that neighborhood is. It shouldn't stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah, in Fresno, I was very, very proud of how they addressed that. And they used a lot of just common sense, right? It's got to fit into the neighborhood that it's moving into in some capacity, right? And I think that, like I told John, you can't discount the value of how you are received by the community that you're trying to move into, right? So in my mind, that aesthetic is a function. It's a functional aspect of your home because what it's doing is it's allowing you to be received into a place that actually you want to live.
Another question back here.
My introduction to tiny houses came when my son was actually involved in selling a lot to someone here in town who built a tiny house in my neighborhood. And I live in a historic district, and to the point you were just making, I was quite interested in how it would look and what it would be because I really had never heard of them before. And I have to say, they did a wonderful job of incorporating it into our neighborhood, and it fits the aesthetic of the neighborhood. And I think that's kind of critical when you're looking at, where and what you're doing with something of that nature. The other question I have is, what's the tallest person you've ever built a tiny house for?
We know. First of all, I think I only got the job of hosting Tiny House Nation with Zack because I'm tall. I'm 6'4", and I think they thought, that'll be so funny, a tall guy in a tiny house. Which I'll take. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I needed the job. The tallest was we built for an NBA player.
Yes, we did. He played for the Spurs, Matt Bonner, and he was 6'10".
Yeah.
And it was fantastic. You better believe the network signed him up right away because that's the biggest. I got all the time, I love tiny houses, but my boyfriend's 6'6". There's no way he could do it. And it's kind of like, well, there might be a way. You understand the concept of custom, right? Custom means like custom. Like it doesn't matter who you are. Like it works because it's custom built to you.
We had to build a larger door opening for him. In fact, it was pretty funny. So that's the answer to that question.
I wanted to touch just real quick because you mentioned something about the aesthetic, and then otherwise we heard about a lot of the stigma coming from them being on trailers. Remember, I call it movable. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's on a trailer. It is very, very, we need to open our minds about what this kind of process can be. It could be on a trailer, sure. It could easily be a portable modular home that can be delivered with a crane or however that works. And when, it comes time to move, that's how it's moved.
Wait a minute. Let's go right here. Hold on.
It's coming.
Okay.
This is a prepared question. I can tell. This is going to be good.
Do you have to have a special license to move a tiny house?
It's a good question. So, sometimes.
Depends on the size and depends on the weight.
So
Sorry, I have one more question.
Okay, do you want me to tell you when? Yeah. So we build most of ours. You have to be under 13 and a half feet tall from the ground up and less than 8 feet wide. If you go over that, I think between 8 and 10 feet, you need a commercial driver's license to do it. Anything wider than 10 feet, then you have to have like a flag truck, a pilot truck, a wide load, stuff going on. So, which can happen, but that's an additional cost. So we build most of ours so that anyone can drive it down the road.
Yeah, that being said, the the height is kind of a non-negotiable,
Yeah.
right? The height, if you want to move something that's really tall, you got to take a specific route that goes around power lines. I mean, it's a very expensive permit, so keeping it under 13 and a half feet is something that we do basically all the time. If it's a home that is not on a trailer and it needs to be portable with a flatbed, then you actually have to make it that much shorter, because the flatbeds are typically a little higher than what a trailer would sit on. So and if you were going to manufacture a modular
I'm going to
home,
buzz you. She's got another question.
and you wanted to drop it off with a crane, it would end up being a little bit shorter, and you might have hard time with the loft.
Your second question?
What state is the most tiny house friendly?
Zach?
Well, I would say at this point the most progressive legislation is coming out of California. But you got to keep in mind, my belief is tiny homes, and this whole idea of tiny homes is a product of the housing crisis. And what I mean by that is that California...
The affordability of housing is what you're talking about. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. But listen, that's the housing that I'm dealing with, so it's a crisis. It's been a crisis in my life for a long time.
I would agree
I'm
it's a
not
crisis.
afraid of calling it a crisis, because it's been there ever since I was 18 and moved out. So, but yeah, it's an affordability crisis.
Thank you.
Now, that being said, when Jay Schaefer built the original tiny house that really kind of kicked this whole thing off, what happened? He drove it right into San Francisco. He drove it right into the heart of what we know as the affordability crisis in housing, right? And that's where it went and lit some light bulbs. If he had driven it into a place like even Little Rock, where I don't think that there is the same kind of affordability crisis here in terms of housing, it wouldn't have made the same kind of headlines. It wouldn't have turned into this big thing. So in my mind, it really is a product of the affordable housing crisis.
Right. Another question? I mean, there's so many. Okay. You, sir. Such a gentleman.
What does our lending institutions consider those tiny houses on wheels, and how do they constitute a loan for that?
That's a great question. I'm going to let Zach answer this, because that has been a sticky one too, and there has been some progress on that front.
Absolutely. As cities start to open up their zoning policy to allow this type of thing, what they're forced to do is they're actually forced to define what it is. So that's been a huge problem for lenders. What is a tiny house? We already went through this. There's no agreed upon definition. That's a really hard thing for a bank to quantify, right? Plus, when it's on wheels and it's portable, they tend to have quite big depreciation rates, right? So what they've been classified as typically is an RV. So you can get an RV loan for a tiny house. They usually require a higher down payment, and it's not a 30-year thing. The longest you'll ever get is about a 15-year loan, which means that even though the home is, half the size and half the price of something else, you're going to pay just as much of a monthly payment because you're paying it off that much faster. But what that does is it means it's not attainable to more people. That being said, now that cities are opening up and quantifying it, lenders are actually enabling themselves to create mortgage loan packages for that. And I work with an organization called Operation Tiny Home. We do villages for homeless veterans around the country. It's amazing. I'm not going to go down that because it's another talk all in itself.
It's a good talk.
But it's a fantastic organization. I'm very proud of everything we've done. One of the best things that we've done is we've brought in some big institutions. One of our main sponsors is Wells Fargo, and to get them, a company like that, to start looking at this as something other than just this like weird fad that's going away, but actually looking at this as something that society might actually be able to utilize, they're creating packages that allow people to take out real mortgages on tiny homes. And we did one, there's a
lot of questions.
We did one in the state of Florida. It was on a foundation, so he was able to get a 30-year mortgage. And after we built the home, after we bought the property, put the whole thing said and done, it was $120,000, and his mortgage was just over $500 a month, right? And he owns his own space. And That's
Good
a
answer.
huge thing.
Good.
That was the first one in Florida.
Bob, you've got one there.
Howdy. I went with a friend to an RV lot, and they had like little pre-built tiny homes. I don't think I'd be able to build something like that myself because it looks very complex. Would buying one pre-built like that be considered a tiny home?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another thing to think about. Like, you don't have to build it yourself for it to be a tiny home. There's been this, I don't want to say myth, but on the internet you can see like, oh, college student built own tiny house for $7,000 and is living all his dreams. And I think that kind of does a little bit of a disservice because while that may be true, that's certainly not the norm. Buying a tiny house, absolutely. And when we started, there really weren't any tiny house builders. There were builders that were like, well, what? Okay, how do we do this tiny house thing? And Zach was doing a lot of hands-on stuff. There are now across the country some very good, very talented tiny house builders that are turning out homes. They're turnkey, ready to go. There's people that are turning out shells that are ready to go, and then you finish out the inside or hire someone to do that. So there's a lot of options.
But if you watch our show, we're constantly encouraging the homeowners to try to get a little hands-on in their tiny home. And the reason that I say that is because the homeowners that we work with that put their own effort into building the tiny homes are the ones that last, that actually pull it off. And part of it is because of that sense of pride and the self-esteem that comes from having contributed to the construction. So I definitely would encourage you, if you are going to go in that, do as much of the work as you can by yourself, because every time you sit down at night and look at the things that you've done, you're going to be reminded of that sense of pride that's going to manifest into your own self-esteem, and that's going to manifest into the rest of your life.
All right. Yeah, right here, sir. New mayor in Little Rock. Okay.
And our new mayor ran on the platform based on collegiality and inclusion and diversity. And in the same breath, he talked about economic development. And I don't believe they're incongruent. Having said that, do you think that the Minneapolis model is one that Little Rock ought to look at?
That's really hard to say, not knowing. If we're being totally honest, I don't live in Minneapolis. I don't live in Little Rock. So to know the intricacies of it, that's a hard question to answer. But in general, we'll have to see how it plays out. But I think what's interesting about Minneapolis is that it will hopefully, in a little bit more affordable way, encourage that residential diversity and address all the things that we talked about, why that's good. I don't know Little Rock well enough to know if that's something that has to happen, but I think if I were living in Little Rock and that's something I was interested in, I would keep an eye on what's going on in Minneapolis and kind of see how that bears out. I mean, that's a non-answer. I understand, but I don't really have an answer.
Yeah, but it took up some time, John.
All right. Yes, you have a question. Actually, we need to get some questions in the back too, but go ahead. How do you get on the show? Good question. Zach and I have nothing to do with that. You reach out to the production company, Loud Television. They will start casting. Where we are at right now, we're on a little hiatus. We did the show. We did our 5th season. We wrapped in mid-November. The show will air for the first time. The new episodes will be airing on A&E, which is a step up for us. We were on FYI, which is under the A&E umbrella. That network died. We didn't kill it though. We're the only thing that survived, so don't blame us. But it's going to be, the new episodes are going to be on A&E, and if they are well received enough, then the network will order more episodes, and then we'll need people like you to call in or to write in and get on the casting, and hopefully we come back to Little Rock.
So we need everybody to tell their friends, mid-March, A&E, watch it, otherwise we'll thank you for forever.
Yeah, Beanie.
I hope you'll go and see the tiny village we already have called Pyramid Village. It dates from the folksy era. It's up at Board Camp, south of Mina. It's a number of pyramids. So they would qualify. I haven't been there in years. I think they're about 20 feet by 20 feet, a whole colony of them. And the main community house is about 2.5-story pyramid. So it's been there since the 50s or 60s. I hope you'll go and see it.
Wow, I don't know if we're going to have time, but gosh, that does sound interesting.
So I am a big fan of tiny home communities. I really believe in the power that designing in social interaction to the space has to create happy lives for people. And when we work with the veterans, with homeless veterans, it's a very powerful dynamic for them. It's, as a veteran, you end up having these senses of like real team unity within your group that kind of end up becoming lost once you get back into civilian life. And creating an environment where people get to feel that team unity, they get to feel like they belong to something, and there's other people that can relate, that they can socialize with, is so important when we're talking about mental health. So, would I live in a tiny home community? Yes, I would. As an advocate for the entire movement, I'm concerned that when we talk about tiny homes, people only think about building these communities, because in creation, if that's the only way that we gain acceptance, it is kind of a long-term path to creating more trailer parks. And and like I said, I would personally love to live in a tiny home community, but I don't think it's a healthy thing for our society to be permitting low-income housing, but only doing it in one specific geographic space.
So we're getting low on time, and I promised a balcony question. What do you got, sir? Yell it.
I'm really curious to hear about your take on the influence of Airbnb on the affordable housing, diverse housing, and how that all fits together, because a lot of people in affluent areas might have something like that in order to help pay for more than they can afford. What are your thoughts?
That's a very, very good question. Airbnb is this new dynamic within our housing, and what I was talking about with accessory dwelling units and how they've been very disappointing in terms of how much of them are being used for the rental market. Well, a lot of that is because they're all being used as vacation rentals, right? Because why would you want somebody permanently when you can have somebody come like a couple times a week and have the finances balance out exactly the same? That is another reason why having that division within the ownership and allowing people a struggling homeowner to partner with somebody looking for a place to live in a better neighborhood, to team up to cover those expenses. And basically, the flip side of that is that vacation rentals have been this really great thing for a lot of people that need that extra income.
It only addresses one half of the equation, is what you're saying. So it's basically it can help supplement the income or the expense of living in a house, but it's not helping the affordable housing for a lower income thing.
And yes. And that vacation rentals have become in our country a very good tool, especially for older demographics, to help them ease the burden of their mortgage. And even like my own mother, who just wants some young energy around, It's like they could use the finances, but there's
a joke in there somewhere, but I'm not going anywhere near it.
We got time for one more.
Yeah, I think we have one more. Okay, this young lady right here.
Let me get the mic to you.
You shot your hand up with enough vigor to catch my eye.
Okay, I'm really curious about what effect living in a tiny house has on your romantic life. Is a boon to dating, or is it just awkward?
Okay, I mean, that depends. What are we talking about? Are we talking about husband and wife with a couple of kids? Because, there are challenges. I mean, that's one of the things. We got a question earlier today, do you build for families? And we do. And one of the big challenges when you're putting, a bunch of people, maybe, some younger people, teenagers or below that, in with adults, to create the kind of privacy that I think we all crave as humans, is difficult because you really cut down on the space. The answer that Zack gave, and I'll let him expand on that that he gave this afternoon was, rather than building like a double wide trailer, you build a second unit. And this is something that we've done a number of times, and they can be connected, but also be disconnected. Does that make sense? They can be connected by, visually with some outdoor stuff, with a causeway over the top. But what you have done is you've given each party a separate space that they can go to. So then you can get it on all night long and just make sure the springs on the tiny house are good.
Listen, and I want to address that also, because we get so much opportunity to talk about this, but so much of the time, our time gets caught up with explaining questions about whether or not you can make love in a tiny house, which seems it's a relevant question, but it's a distraction a little bit from a much deeper, more important subject that deserves being addressed.
Okay, you tell me something more important than
and I know this is my last thing, but there is a really important thing that's happening, right? And I see it when I go to tiny home festivals and I talk, I see it, and I see it right here in this room. Everybody who's here that considers themselves part of the baby boomer age demographic or older, raise your hand. So it's a huge percentage of the interest in tiny houses is coming from that demographic. And as a country, we have a very big incentive and a lot of cause to start paying attention to that need. We have 2/3 of the homes in our country are owned by the baby boomer generation. 1/3 is owned by people older than that. So 3/5 of the homes in our country are owned by people 54 and up. They're the most expensive homes in our country by and large. This is a age group that is retiring by 10,000 people a day right now, right? Who have by and large parked their excessive cash into their homes, expanding the size, and they're looking at downsizing their homes at some point in order to retire. Well, who's going to buy those homes? So right there, if we can only talk about one thing in this, I want you to go home and have that thought in your mind, because we have this real big approaching issue, and we don't feel like we have any way to adjust it. We don't have it's out of our hands, right? Well, no, we do have some tools. Dividing homes into duplexes and triplexes is one method. ADUs is one method. Building townhouses and apartments is another method. Tiny homes is just another piece of that.
Well, I don't know how we got from making love to baby boomers in one answer. But as a baby boomer, I am grateful that you even, went there.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you. Yeah, that was an ad lib. That wasn't in the speech.
No, you wrote it down right there.
It's right here.
Yeah, right. Part. I can see it from here.
Thank you. We appreciate you very much, and it was as great as I thought it would be. I love you guys. Now, what we're going to do is, I'm sure a few of you have heard that we were shut down for 35 days. Or 32 days, 35 days. So we're opening tonight. The tiny house, the exhibit, is open right now. It will be open until 8 p.m. It's free to go in, and you can look around if you haven't seen it. And I just wanted you to note that tomorrow, between 11 and 1, in the tiny house, on the patio, these two gentlemen will be sitting on the patio waiting for all your questions and comments, I suppose. But
bring beer.
Would be better.
We'll be fine.
No, they can't bring beer.
No, I was joking. Zach, terrible idea. Told you, don't bring the beer.
Wow.
Root beer.
John thinks he's on vacation. This is what's going on.
Yes. So they will be there. It also will be free tomorrow at the tiny house. Questions 11 to 1. Open right now. Enjoy yourself. Thank you for coming, and we appreciate you very much.
Yeah, come by tomorrow.
Thank you so much for coming.